Welcome to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcast on the EU's Just Transition Fund.
The EU aims to cut greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% by 2030 and achieve climate neutrality by 2050. But the Green Transition 2050 won't happen without making some financial investments.
Hence the Just Transition Fund, to support those regions most affected by the transition to a low-carbon economy. But how big will this fund be and how will it work? Stay with us.
The European Union has set itself on an ambitious green path, climate neutrality by 2050. But that's easier said than done.
Reducing greenhouse gas emissions will have an impact on jobs and regional economies, especially in regions relying on fossil fuels and carbon-intensive industries. To support these, in January 2020, the European Commission proposed the creation of a Just Transition Fund. Now, what is new about this proposal?
Well, the EU counts several funds that support the shift to a low-carbon economy in one way or another, including the European Structural and Investment Funds, the Regional Development Fund, the Cohesion Fund, or the European Social Fund.
There are also several investment programmes that support climate transition, such as the European Fund for Strategic Investments, which is soon to be replaced by the InvestEU programme. The difference with the future Just Transition Fund is that this would offer much more tailored support to the Just Transition regions.
Something the Parliament had been calling for since 2018. But how will it work in practice? Stay with us.
Well, first of all, it's important to know that funding will be available to all member states, even if the focus will be on regions with the biggest social, economic and environmental transition challenges. Now, how much money will be available?
The proposed budget for the fund is €7.5 billion, to be complemented with resources from cohesion policy funds and national co-financing, up to a total of €30 to €50 billion.
The fund will be part of what's known as the Just Transition Mechanism, which will also include resources under InvestEU up to €45 billion and loans from the European Investment Bank up to €25 to €30 billion. So in total, funding mobilised under the mechanism is expected to reach €100 billion.
The InvestEU scheme and the EIB loan facility will have a broader geographical and thematic scope than the Just Transition Fund, so they'll be available to territories outside the Just Transition zone, upon one condition: that projects are beneficial to Just Transition territories. For example, transport or energy infrastructure projects that improve the connectivity of these territories.
As for the scope, the two pillars will also cover a broad range of activities such as district heating and gas networks, energy efficiency of buildings, energy and transport infrastructure, and social infrastructure.
That's right, and there's yet one more difference between the different pillars. While the Just Transition Fund will primarily provide grants, the InvestEU scheme will seek to bring in private investment, and the EIB loan facility will leverage public funding.
Now, who exactly will benefit? Stay with us.
The Just Transition Fund will support workers, companies and regional authorities, encouraging investments that facilitate this transition. Examples of activities supported are investments in SMEs that lead to economic diversification and reconversion, investments in research and innovation activities that foster the transfer of advanced technologies, or investments in digitalisation and digital connectivity, upskilling and retraining of workers and helping them to change job, to mention a few. But which regions will be eligible for support?
Well, this will be decided on the basis of the economic and social impacts of the transition, especially with regard to employment in the fossil fuel sector and the transformation needs of the most polluting industries. So based on these, member states will prepare just transition plans together with the authorities of the territories concerned.
These will describe just how the transition process to a climate neutral economy is expected to happen at national and regional level, and how the Just Transition Fund can help achieve the goals.
Now, what's the view of stakeholders?
Well, opinions are still expected from EU advisory committees and national parliaments, but organisations bringing together local and regional authorities have already stressed the need for cohesion policy to have sufficient funding, at least 1/3 of the future EU budget in their view. And they warn that any new funding resources should not come at the expense of existing cohesion funds.
A difficult battle to win, considering the pressure from some member states to cap the budget at around 1% in order to reflect the smaller size of the post-Brexit EU.
The Climate Action Network goes even a step further and wants the entire Green Deal to help increase the EU's 2030 climate target to a 65% cut in emissions.
European think tanks such as Bruegel say €1 trillion of investment over 10 years is too little when compared to real investment needs, a drop in the ocean, according to some climate experts. And the European Policy Centre fears that incoherent EU legislation and member states' failure to achieve the emission reductions target will end up undermining the Green Deal.
So what's the outlook?
Well, as soon as the proposal was presented by the Commission, members debated it in plenary and called for measures to ensure that the transition does not affect existing policies such as cohesion, agriculture and research. And it works for both people and businesses. They also stressed the need for fresh funding rather than recycling of money.
In the Council and the Parliament, the proposal will now be examined by the relevant working party and committees. But in the context of the hard political battle being fought around the future EU budget, negotiations on the final shape and allocation of the Just Transition Fund are only one piece of the puzzle.
You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcasts.